Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming here in person to the African Union Mission here in Washington, D.C., and also everyone who's joining us online from the rest of the world, wherever you are. My name is Hannah Wanjiya-Ryder. I'm the CEO of Development Reimagined, and it is my pleasure to be your moderator for this important event. We're really excited to be having this event. It is a joint event with the African Union Development Agency, AUDA-NEPAD, and it is focused, as I'm sure you all know, which is why you're here, on the role of development finance institutions in enhancing cross-border regional infrastructure. Cross-border regional infrastructure, actually, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping before we begin, which is to just say we do have some translation available for those of you in the room. Online, we will be providing a French translated version in due course, but for those of you who would like to listen in French in the room, please use channel 2 to do so. Cross-border regional infrastructure is very important on the continent. It's a particular area where we have suffered significantly in terms of the import of being able to increase the infrastructure. There is not just a gap in terms of overall annual financing for infrastructure, but specifically with cross-border infrastructure, we face significant challenges. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today and how we can address that gap at this point. In terms of the run of show, we'll begin with 2 introductory speeches. And in particular, the first speech will be from Her Excellency Nados Bekele Thomas, who is the CEO of AUDA-NEPAD, and we're very pleased that she has been able to grace us with her presence today to share AUDA-NEPAD's perspective and work on cross-border regional infrastructure to date, and also the opportunity going forwards. We'll then have a further introductory remarks from His Excellency Wu Peng online, who is the current ambassador of China to South Africa, speaking about China's role in cross-border infrastructure on Africa, and he was also the former DG for Africa at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs prior to that. After that, we will have a panel discussion, and I will invite our esteemed panelists to come up and we'll introduce them at that point. And then we'll have a Q&A with the audience and finishing with closing remarks after that. So please, as we're engaging in this discussion, please please think of questions for our panelists, your own views on the issues, where the key gaps are, and also, importantly, on the solutions. We are here to discuss solutions. Despite the uncertainties in the environment that we have, solutions are crucial. So without further ado, let me ask Her Excellency, Ms. Nados Bekele Thomas, please join us to give us your opening remarks. Thank you.
So can you hear me now? Okay, so we gather today not in calm waters, but in the heart of a geopolitical storm. The old global order, once seen as stable and predictable, is now fraying. Nation and nationalist ideologies surge. Multilateralism is questioned. Institutions feel transactional. The world feels adrift. But for Africa, this disruption is not just danger. It is an invitation to build differently, to build bravely, to turn volatility into sovereignty, to stop waiting for consensus and instead lead with clarity. We often speak, sometimes too comfortably, of Africa's potential. The youngest population, immense natural wealth, flashes of world-class innovation, but potential perpetually unrealized becomes a burden. Let's be honest, our continent is weighed down by a brutal infrastructure deficit, up to 108 billion annually. Unbuilt roads, unreliable power, patchy data. It's more than numbers. It's the daily drag on productivity, dignity, and possibility. But let me ask you this. Is infrastructure the root problem? Or is it a symptom? A visible fracture in a deeper foundation we've yet to repair? The real bottleneck, ladies and gentlemen, is the excluded majority. We rage rightly against the so-called African risk premium, a damaging fiction peddled by global finance. But even as we fight skewed perceptions, we must face a harder truth at home. I'm saying this because we are reimagining now financing. How can we speak of an industrial renaissance or seamless trade with 80% of our labor force, which is locked in informality? This is not just a stat. It's a human capital emergency. It is the silent weight crushing our ambitions. We cannot build the Africa of African free trade area with most of our people outside the structures of protection, training, and opportunity. We risk designing high-tech engines with no fuel, no drivers. This is our reckoning. And it is why frameworks like AFCFTA, the PIDA, the AIDA, the CADP, and the CPMP matter more than ever. But let us be clear. These are not checklists. They are strategic tools, and they must evolve into instruments of a productive revolution. Here, the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, emerges not just as an implementer, but as Africa's adaptive intelligence, a continental brain trust that must connect the dots, sharpen the tools, and confront reality with strategic courage. So how do we finance this future? Not with business as usual. We must reimagine financing with the same radical energy we bring to policy. And let me propose 5 pivots for a bold new architecture. One is a Pan-African infrastructure investment platform, a digital, transparent marketplace where projects meet African capital, from pension funds to sovereign wealth to diaspora flows, with blockchain for accountability, tokenization for participation, and ratings for investor confidence. This platform will break silos and spark collaboration and cooperation. 2 is diaspora infrastructure bonds. The diaspora sends over $50 billion home annually. Let's move from remittances to returns. Jointly issued bonds, regionally backed, revenue generating, accessible through mobile platforms, stable coins, or fintech tools. Let them invest not just in memories, but in the continent's momentum. 3 is the Green and Blue Infrastructure Fund. Blended finance for infrastructure that respects our climate and harnesses our geography. From renewable energy corridors to nature-based coastal defenses, let us unlock carbon markets, ESG capital, and climate resilience in one stroke. 4 is regional development tokens, backed by real assets from energy grids to transport systems. These tokens provide fractional investment opportunities for Africans to own their infrastructure. Revenue sharing, tradable, trust-based, and decentralized. Number 5 is a multilateral infrastructure credit enhancement facility backed by ADB, Africa 50, and other regional allies. This facility would reduce investment risk, enhance project bankability, and ensure African ownership of cross-border mega projects. But ladies and gentlemen, none of this matters if we build infrastructure without the people to use it, to power it, and benefit from it. That's why our financing strategy must be grounded in 3 core shifts. The first one is human capital as a foundation. Education, digital fluency, and vocational skills must be radically prioritized. Formalization is not bureaucracy, it is inclusion. Decent work is not a slogan, it is the launchpad of the AFCFTA. 2 is production-driven integration. We must stop connecting points A to B unless we are also connecting fields to factories, workers to value chain, and ideas to markets. Infrastructure must serve industrial ecosystem, not just movement. 3 is sovereign financing as a strategy. We must mobilize our own capital, domestic savings, insurance, pensions, diaspora, sovereign wealth. Every dollar kept in passive reserves is a missed opportunity to build. The goal is not just to attract capital, it is to shape it. So, what must we do now? I would say execute with focus. Prioritize infrastructure that enables production, inclusion, and resilience. Confront the 80% crisis. Align labor policies with formalization, skills, and decent work. Empower the African Union Development Agency. Fund it, trust it, let it adapt and lead. Demand more from DFIs. Don't just fund studies, fund transformation. And build trust through action. Governance is not a favor to investors. It is the foundation of our own growth. And as I conclude, I would say the reckoning is now. Colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, the time for poetic potential is over. This is our moment of productive reckoning. A world in flux is asking, will Africa rise on its terms, with its people, and for its future? To policymakers, embed the 80% formalization challenge at the center of everything. To investors, the real risk is missing this revolution. To the African Union Development Agency and our institutions, I would say lead with vision, data, and bold execution. To all of us, the time is now, not for incrementalism, but for defiant, determined, deliberate transformation. The frameworks exist. The tools are ready. Let's build the sovereign, productive, integrated Africa we've long imagined. Together, urgently, boldly, and now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I think all of us will agree that was a fantastic kickoff to our deliberations today, encouraging us to rise on our own terms and avoid incrementalism in order to avoid this unrealized potential, as you kicked off with, and truly not just reimagine, but take action. So thank you very much, Your Excellency, for firing us up for an excellent implementation-based discussion today, this afternoon. Let us now move on to the panel discussion. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our very esteemed panelists who bring some incredible experience and background to our discussions today. So I would like to invite them to join me here. I'm going to move to sit on the panel and introduce them one by one as we go ahead. So thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Now we're going to have a panel discussion. We'll have some time. I'll put some joint and specific questions to our esteemed panelists, but also then we'll also have an opportunity for audience Q&A. We'll be happy to take questions from the room and also online. So if you have questions online, please do post that and the team will pass them on. But let me introduce the panel first. To my immediate left, I have His Excellency Ambassador Malcolmson, who is currently the Chief Director, Economic and Social Development for the Department for International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa, DIRCO. Thank you very much for joining us. And brings a wealth of experience, and you will tell us, I'm sure, immediately the relevance of your experience here today as well to this conversation. Next to him, we have Honorable Mr. Jude Moore, who is currently the non-resident senior fellow at Center for Global Development and former Minister of Public Works Infrastructure in Liberia. So thank you very much for joining us as well. And to my immediate right, we have Mr. Amin Idris Adum, who's the Director for Infrastructure, Industrialization, Trade and Regional Integration at AUDA-NEPAD as well. Thank you so much for joining us and your also wealth of experience in your position. And last but not least, Mr. Banji Feintola, who is joining us from the African Finance Corporation, and he's the Executive Director of Financial Services. Thank you so much for joining us today. Right. So let me put my first question to all of you today. There have been a lot of, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure, a lot of estimates by different organizations about the infrastructure gap on the continent and including cross-border infrastructure. In your views, what are the challenges with current financing models or the gaps that exist in the financing models and the needs for reform that would enable more cross-border infrastructure? Why isn't there enough cross-border infrastructure on our continent? Let me put that question to you, Excellency Malcolm Sim.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Your Excellency, CEO of AUDA-NEPAD, Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, good afternoon. Before I attempt to answer your question, you did say I should speak about the relevance. And it allows me just to reminisce a bit. I find the older you get, the more you want to reminisce. I feel like I'm coming home today because I was in the original team that created NEPAD. I was seconded to President Mbeki's office from the end of 1999 until 2005. And Professor Nkuhlu was the President's economic advisor and first head of what we called the NEPAD Secretariat back then. And he and I opened the NEPAD Secretariat back in the day. We got it adopted first by the Lusaka, the last OAU summit in Lusaka, and the first AU summit in South Africa. And in fact, we were struggling at some point to come up with a name. It was initially called the New African Initiative. And President Obasanjo sent myself, Sunday Dogonyaro from Nigeria, and Smunda Mokoena into a corner and said, come up with a name. And we came up with the name NEPAD. And it was immediately adopted by the NEPAD Heads of State and Government Implementation Committee in Abuja before the AU Summit in South Africa. I was involved in the team that produced the original NEPAD documents, the CARDIP, the original infrastructure plans, all the original NEPAD documents. So it really feels like I'm coming home. And I served on NEPAD matters until 2015, from 2000, apart from 4 years in China, and as the alternate member on the NEPAD steering committee. So it really does feel like I'm coming home. I mean, it's a very broad question that you're asking. And I think there's a multitude of reasons, both at the technical level, but more broadly speaking, obviously one of the biggest issues is the cost of finance. The debt crisis that we're facing in Africa. You referred, Madam CEO, to the question of the perceptions of risk, which are completely unjustified. It's more perception than reality. And Africa, more than any other continent, more than any other region, is adversely impacted by how much it costs to raise the money in a currency that fluctuates, and then at the end of the life cycle of a project costs us much more than we intended it to cost, which is why in the work we were doing on BRICS and the New Development Bank, we were seeking to fund and finance infrastructure projects in the national currencies of the countries involved. So through the BRICS New Development Bank, we were doing national bond issuances to raise domestic financing in the currencies of the countries, so that you wouldn't then have to be financing debt based on the dollar, with the currency fluctuations that come with that. So those are two major issues, is the cost of capital and the risk perception. But of course, traditionally in Africa, our project preparation has not been good. We come up with lists of projects, but when we come to send the pipeline of projects through to investors, we find that they're actually not bankable yet. They're not project ready. So I think AUDA-NEPAD came up with a brilliant supports mechanism to help with project preparation. The ADB also came up with similar mechanisms to get projects ready. Finance for project preparation has also always been an issue. So that's why development finance institutions and multilateral development banks are critical in providing the initial financing to make sure that the project preparation gets a project to the point where it becomes attractive to private sector investors and to blended financing options and PPP options. But that's a critical point that's missing. And finally, I'd like to say with the cross-border multi-country projects, we always have a problem with the country ownership. countries that are involved in the project do need to bring their own financing to the project. They need to establish ownership. They need to have champions for the project, and they need to make sure that as administrations change, the projects are embedded in the national development plans of the countries involved. So it's not dependent on one administration or another.
Thanks. So you've raised three particular issues, cost of capital, stroke risk perceptions, and I think those two things go together, project preparation and country ownership. Mr. Moore, would you agree?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure being here again. Yeah, definitely would. I thought he was actually reading from my notes. But I think I would just go back a little on the cost of financing issue that, oh yeah. I will go back a little on the cost of financing issue because I teach a class on infrastructure as a tool of foreign policy. And one of the first things we go through with the class is, how is infrastructure financed? Normally, infrastructure is financed using domestic savings. But across Africa, domestic savings is really, really low. So if you don't have domestic savings, then you have to seek external savings in the form of grants or loans. And there are hard limits to what African countries can borrow, and there's just not enough grants. Concessional financing is low. So I have to come back to Ambassador Malcolmson's point that the cost of financing is one of the biggest issues that we face. Then, because we haven't done enough cross-border projects, the expertise for execution of cross-border project becomes an issue where it gets in the way. So, having been Minister of Works, sometimes when projects stall, they get more expensive because you pay for idle days. And so there are times where the project becomes more expensive by not doing anything than even finishing the project. And so when you do cross-border project in which the implementation is not happening as it should, then the project becomes even more expensive than we initially thought it would be. And so part of that is the way we solve the problem first on the financing side, at least from the perspective of multilateral development banks, we have to structure financing in such a way that you reward countries who do cross-border projects. So there's more money available for cross-border projects than there are for individual projects that are trying to do. And then the international development agencies, including NEPAD, can build capacity to help with the implementation of these projects so that they remain on budget and on time.
Thank you so much. So the lack of savings and concessional funds as another challenge, the lack of expertise in infrastructure building, and also there's something around structuring finance and the incentives for cross-border versus domestic infrastructure. So we're building a list. Director Adum, do you want to add anything more to that list?
Thank you very much. In fact, Dave and GD really went deep into the challenge of cross-border infrastructures. But let me maybe add maybe a couple of words here. And this is very much related to the complexity of cross-border infrastructures project themselves. Number one, the very first problem is the ownership of the infrastructure itself. Cross-border infrastructure is not owned by one country, but normally by several countries. And it's very difficult actually when you are imagining the project to know precisely and to say who is going to own this piece of infrastructure. And that brings as well the issue and the challenge of accountability right away. Now, because of this issue of ownership and accountability from the very early stage, it's very difficult even to imagine the project, to plan for it, and to identify it properly. But even if you have been capable of doing that, you still have to go back to the A and B, meaning the ownership and the accountability, when it comes to the challenge of the preparation, because project preparation is quite a big challenge, and it's even more challenging for regional infrastructures. This one. And the reason is simple. Usually, when a country A goes to African Development Bank or to the World Bank or to the AFC, let's say, Africa Finance Corporation, to borrow money for building an infrastructure, it's easy. Why? Because usually countries are members and accountability is very clear. Contractual arrangements can be done easily. But then when it comes to regional infrastructures, usually they are being led by regional mechanisms, and regional mechanisms are not members of the MDBs. So MDBs don't even listen to them. Usually they won't. They accommodate us, in fact. We go to see them through their Office of Regional Integration, basically, where they have a little bit of budget for regional integration, and that's it. And this amount of money is usually insufficient, to finance even the early project preparation. So this is extremely important. And then, of course, when let's actually put it like that, because we usually try to find specific solutions. Like in AUDA-NEPAD, we come with the process we call service delivery mechanism. So service delivery mechanism in which we say, well, for regional projects, before we go even to talk about preparation phase, let's talk about early, project preparation, in which actually we try to enable the environment. But then to get the resources from member states is almost impossible. So let's go to the MDBs, and the envelope the MDBs will put actually before you is very small. Then we say, let's try to blend actually the solution, MDBs, philanthropies here and there. And for years, and I will conclude here, we have made one big challenge, because we go project by project. And that wasn't really helpful, because they asked the question, Hannah, why do we have a very little number of regional infrastructures? Well, because for years, even though the NEPAD, we were going projects by projects, going to see the MDBs, going to see philanthropies, member states, bilateral relationship. We try to blend actually financing for the early project preparation. And then we finance one phase of the early project preparation, then we go back again. Then now we come with another solution, by the way. We say, well, I think we learn from what could be considered a mistake for all of us, actually. We say, let's now move to what we call portfolio project preparation phase, in which actually when we go to see the MDBs, we structure actually a financing together. Now we're going to take like 4 or 5 projects at the same time that have regional dimension, and we prepare them. Then we can move them before the project preparation facility. So there is a lot of challenges, but thanks God, there are also solutions that actually we are really driving. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I think you've given us even more flavor and understanding of the challenges around the project preparation and the sort of disconnect between those who are kind of preparing, but also then actually executing and even financing. But also you started to go into a little bit of the solutions, and we're going to come to that. But but let me ask Director Ventola, would you have anything else to add to the list of the challenges that we have specifically with cross-border infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you. And I think the benefit of speaking last is that everyone would have said everything you wanted to say. So ideally, I should just say I agree with the last speaker. But I would just add a few points. One, when we talk about project development, I think my fellow panelists were addressing it more from, more from even having the resources, because it's costly. I mean, it's early stage. In fact, in AFC, we call it the venture capital of infrastructure investing, because you can lose all your money, right, easily. So I think it's not just the money, though. We also need to talk about the expertise of putting projects together. And that's an area where we've spent a lot of time and efforts trying to develop the in-house capacity to, prepare projects. I'm sure many people know a good example is Lobito, who we are the lead developer for the Lobito rail project. So I'm speaking from a point of so many years of experience trying to manage a cross-border or, a project that cuts across, in this case, Angola, Zambia, DRC, and potentially could include Tanzania. So I think getting the expertise in-house is very important. When you have one success story and some failures, you learn from those, and then you can also, improve on that. Secondly, I don't think anyone mentioned this, but equity is always a problem, having the right equity in projects. So even when a project appears to be bankable, what we typically see is that the equity that is needed from the sponsors is always missing or inadequate. And as a result of that, you see bankers are unwilling to lend on a project finance basis because they feel that there just isn't enough coming in, to support or carry the risk of the project. I want to talk about one more thing. Maybe we'll talk about other things later. But I think when we talk about risk and the risk perception, I agree, cost of capital is high, but I think a lot of that is also coming from media perception. There's a report by Africa Practice that says, Africa pays about $4.2 billion in excess interest payments simply from negative media perception of the continent. So I think as a continent, obviously, we need to do a lot more in order to do that. I also agree that the amount of domestic savings is not a lot, but it's over $2 trillion. So, and we have to start from somewhere. So $2 trillion between asset managers, insurers, central bank reserves, that money needs to work for Africa. My former life, I was a treasurer. I spent all my time coming here to New York to beg, asset managers for funding. But this is money that came from Africa, which they are managing on our behalf. And when they want to lend it back to me to finance infrastructure projects, they ask me for risk premium on top of the money. So I think there's a disconnect there. So we need to mobilize domestic capital. And I think we start from what we have and other people will follow once they see that.
Thanks so much. So success will follow success. But in the meantime, obviously, again, you've added to the list to a degree the aspect around equity specifically, and also this point in kind of execution as well in terms of expertise. So with all of that, and we also had the CEO of AUDA-NEPAD giving us already some suggestions and proposals, the 5 pillars for platforms, certain types of bonds, certain types of funds, which could help to tackle many of these issues across border infrastructure. Some ideas for ensuring more cross-border infrastructure on the continent. And Director Adum, you also talked about the portfolio approach, etc. So I want to put the next question to all of you in terms of, is there a way that how to make these, how can we talk about these in practical terms? So what does it mean, for example, to have these sorts of new solutions? What would it, how can they be seen in practice from your experience of either bringing together or seeing cross-border infrastructure pull together? How could we do more? How could we take these issues to scale? How can we build more cross-border infrastructure? How do we address these challenges? So let me go in the same order that we started with. And I think in particular, I think SADC, Ambassador Malcolmson, the experience from the SADC region.
No, thank you very much. And before I just talk about SADC, obviously, I think your point about success breeds success is a critical one, because there's wonderful work that's going on all over the place. So I mentioned BRICS and the New Development Bank. There's obviously work that AUDA-NEPAD is doing. There's work that the ADB is doing. There's work the IFC is doing, the World Bank. There's things that we've managed to achieve with our partners like the TICAD partners, Japan, FOCAC, the Chinese. Initially, for many years, they only wanted to do bilateral work. And it took many years working with the Chinese as co-chairs to get them to agree to work on cross-border multi-country projects in Africa. And the only reason they did that is because they'd had experience with doing that in ASEAN. They'd worked with ASEAN on some cross-border projects, and only once they saw that could be done that they agreed to do it in Africa. So what I'm saying is it then becomes critical for agencies like AUDA-NEPAD to look at all these different examples of where there has been success, where things have worked, what has worked, and to bring those to bear in a partnership with all the key development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, institutions, partnerships, to see how to roll out some of these projects. And even within the NEPAD portfolio, we have examples of the fiber optic cable project on the East African coast, which was one of the original NEPAD projects. It took a long time to get off the ground, but eventually what worked is we got a consortium agreement with some of the key IT providers in Africa. And that's how we managed to roll out the fiber optic cable project on the East Coast. Kazangulu Bridge, working with the Japanese partners, was another one. And then there's some low-hanging fruit, which we don't often talk about, the soft infrastructure issues. How do we construct one-stop border posts? How do we harmonize the regulatory and legislative environments across countries to ensure that we're able to do these projects? I think, some of those soft issues are almost as effective as the hard infrastructure in opening up the trade corridors and making sure that the African Continental Free Trade Area can work optimally in the way that we want it to work. So for me, I think, as I say, there's enough examples of what's worked. We need agencies like AUDA-NEPAD to bring together that work and coordinate modeling of success stories to roll out into the future.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think, so I'll give a couple of examples. One is we were trying to do an airport project, and the funding was coming from BADEA, from the 5 Arab funds, plus the European Investment Bank. And so one of the first questions that we had to answer was, whose procurement rules do we use? You're dealing with 6 different financiers. Each of them has a different set of procurement rules. So once we settled the question of whose procurement rules we're going to use, it cut out most of the problems that we have to do. So again, one of the first things that we have to do in terms of coordination, because, going back to your list, one of the things I didn't mention was the cost of coordination, the effort to make sure everyone is on the same page so that people are responding to their emails on time. So one of the ways we got around that is, for everyone who's a part of the project, if you do not respond to the email within 3 days, we assume that you agree with the decisions that we've taken. You can have those rules in the implementation process that sort of forces the project to move forward. I think that's one of the things that we can look at. I also think that on this question of implementation, to his point, is that across Asia, we really do not need to recreate the wheel. That across Asia, there's significant experience doing all kinds of projects, similar in the same terrain and the same governance and weaknesses in governance that we face across Africa that they've had in Asia. And I think going to Asia, working with them in Asia can be an opportunity for us here. Because I want to add this, I wanted to say this before I made my first point, that everything we have described here described the world before before the last few months. Right? The world has changed so drastically that we actually have to rethink some of the things that we thought we knew before and the ways we went about doing things before. That one of the things we have to stress here, and for all of the events that have to do with Africa, is to understand that we have to build new relationships. The kinds of relationships we had with the West before, first of all, it's questionable if they were all profitable, but let's be very generous and even assume that they were. The time has come now for us to look in different places for ideas, and I think Asia offers us excellent opportunities. I was looking at a report that in the 10 years between 2012 and 2022, 144 countries saw their non-US exports increase. The US used to be the destination of 20% of global exports in 2000. It's down to 13. So the centrality of the American economy, as important as it is, not the direction in which the world is going. On important projects, complex mega projects like the ones we're trying to do, maybe Asia offers us better partnership, better examples, and better models than looking to Europe or the United States to be able to fix those.
Thanks very much. Good points. The importance of reinvention, building new relationships, the coordination and looking to others for experience, but also talking about the experience that we've had and the success that we've had on the continent as well. Director Adum and Director Philintola, would you both, what would you suggest as required in terms of the answers? And I'm actually very interested, you mentioned libido, so please do bring libido into your answer if possible, in terms of something very concrete. But Director Adum first.
Thank you, Anna. This is a question that always come. What do we need to do things differently, usually? And the interesting part is that we all actually come with various different answers. All of them, by the way, are very valid, but we hardly actually put them into practice usually. But I would like to share with you what we think and we are also experiencing and doing, by the way, at AUDA-NEPAD here. If you want to think about regional infrastructures, you always need to think big first, very big. Not just, of course, you have very small. You need actually to show a proof of concept, but usually you need to think big. And thinking big starts always by a big continental framework. One of the success that we are having for the last few years is the launching of what CEO mentioned, the Continental Power System Master Plan. And this is huge. We are saying that we want to multiply the Africa power generation capacity by 5 between now and 2040, moving from 230 gigawatt of power generation to 1,200. So when you look at the magnitude, this kind of project, and you start talking about it, usually people will listen to you first. And this is extremely important because the cost capital that's required is quite massive. But then you also need to make sure that you translate that into regional programs. And you translate that into regional program in a way that is very pragmatic, especially in terms of planning the execution. You start basically by where the resources are. If you look at the Continental Power System as a plan, of course, most of all the regions want to start at the same time, but there are more investments in regions that have regulatory maturity, let's say like the southern region or the eastern region, for instance, but also where we have the presence of the resources are quite massive, and there are already pretty much like demand actually coming from a neighboring region like the East, investing massively into power generation, knowing that this southern actually region, which have, I would say, the fastest industrial development growth in the continent, actually is expressing a huge demand. So what does it tell you? It tells you that when there is a market and where there is a market, investments actually come in. And the way actually we did the Continental Power System Master Plan is driven by the idea that we need actually to create a market. That's why we come as well with the other, I would say, the parallel framework, which is the AFSEM, Africa Single Electricity Market. Now, we are also using regional mechanism like the regional power pool to make sure that they coordinate at the regional level, and they push through the creation of actually this market, because this is extremely important. Now, and I'm going to conclude here, the lessons about what need to be done basically are about 4. Once you have the big framework, you also need to strengthen the policy and the regulatory. This is extremely important around the project, around actually concept of the project, the idea of the project. If you talk about energy, you really need to make sure that the regulatory environment, the policy environment is quite stable, is clear, is transparent, is rigorous. The same thing for transport, the same thing for water, not only for the energy, the same thing for the ICT. And that's what we are doing at AUDA-NEPAD. And secondly, make sure as well, being at the regional level, that you align the execution of this regional project to the regional development plan, actually, because this is extremely important. Usually we don't do that, because if you don't do that, ministers of planning and ministers of finance won't put the resources from their side, because at the end of the day, regional project is first a national project before it become actually regional, And then thirdly, the capacity and the capabilities are extremely important. One of the things that, and I think that Banji was speaking about, that the capacities, the skills, the capabilities, the systems, everything actually. This one must as well be there. And finally, and I think this is extremely important, I'm going to conclude here by that one, we always overlook, I will say, the importance of the local private sector. When we think private sector, we always think abroad, coming from Asia, yes, we want more from Asia, or coming from the Western world. We forget that sometime, or even very often, the local private sector, or even the regional private sector, is mature enough, strong enough. Take most of the South African companies. What actually would refrain them from investing in Eastern Africa for infrastructures, or the Nigerian businesses? What actually should refrain them from investing in Central Africa in regard to infrastructures? We ran a study about the 10 years implementation of the initial PIDA, Program for Infrastructures Development in Africa. We've got good numbers. We've seen that during the last 10 years, we expected about $30 billion investments, but we ended up with $84 billion investments. The good news, and this is extremely good news, but the other good news is that half of this investment come directly from national treasuries, from governments. And then about, that's like 40 billion. Then the remaining 40 billion, like 20 billion come from China in the form of debt. And then about 20 billion come actually from infrastructure consortium in Africa. This is again another actually debt, right? So at the end of the day, we're gonna reimburse everything. But the private sector is very tiny, 3% of the total of this. If you compare that to Southeast Asia, it's about 17% at the same time, whereas in Africa, but this figure is also not necessarily true, because this is only for regional infrastructures. When it comes to national infrastructure, it's completely different. It goes up to 14%. And the good news, if you look at actually national infrastructures, half of it is coming from local private sectors that come actually in JV, joint venture, with international players. That means that it's already happening. But we in the development world and industry, we have this tendency of overlooking this and not talking a lot about that. So that as well must change. Thank you.
Okay. I think I'll just add a few comments to that. So I fully agree the private sector is important, and AFC is an example of public-private partnership, because we were conceived to be the public and the private sector doing development finance. So it's a good example. But I wanted to touch on mobilizing domestic capital, which I think is important. And I think if you're asking what we need to do, some of the things we need to do starts with reforms, pension reforms. Across Africa today, we're talking cross-border investment. A lot of pension funds are not even allowed to invest outside of their own country. So, in fact, up till now, in some countries, pension funds cannot even invest in infrastructure. You know, the typical asset allocation is people buying treasury bills and bonds of the sovereign, essentially financing budget deficit. And sometimes you don't blame them. Interest rate is 20, 30%. If the risk-free rate is 20, 30%, why do you want to worry about project development and all those exotic, difficult things that are so hard to understand? So I think there's some reform that we need to think about on the pension side. We need to think about capital market integration. You know, a company in Kenya should be able to raise capital across the entire continent, you know, and I think that's pretty important. Otherwise, we will still not be talking serious things. You talked about standardization. I think that's important, and coordination. Many years ago, we tried to standardize project development on the continent by creating a group called AFIDA. It didn't quite work well, but you know, we're having another group now because I see Babajide here called AMFI, which is the Alliance for African Multilateral Financial Institutions. Part of the goal eventually is to start standardizing and seeing how we can make things much easier and investment decisions are taken as quickly as possible. I also think it's important to talk about the role of MDBs. If you're talking of what to do, and there are MDBs in Africa. What are we doing to strengthen them? Because, in fact, I actually do love what is going on in the world right now. Because now we have to look inward and say, in our own institutions, how do we strengthen them? Because if we don't strengthen them, these are institutions whose funding is dependent on their credit rating. I mean, most of the MDBs have better credit rating than all the African sovereigns, and they capitalize capital from all over the world. In our own case, we use our A3 rating to do guarantees and help African sovereigns and projects to have access to global capital. But how do we strengthen them? So we need to think about it even as African governments that, hey, our own financial institutions, this is the time for us to look at them because they play a huge role, counter-cyclical role in helping the continent to develop. So we need to start that charity from home.
Great points. Thank you. So I have think big. I think also you made, Director Adam, you made me think of a phrase that we often use in Development Reimagined, which is a build the nest and the birds will come attitude to some of these projects. I think we need to be more kind of proactive with regards to the projects, using the local private sector. And I would also say, let me add to that, with local content, I think also provides some kind of local incentives for moving on cross-border infrastructure. And you talked, Director Fayintola, around enabling, I think, adjusting the rules to make cross-border infrastructure more plausible. So some of the financial rules that we have in our own countries that make it possible, and then strengthening the African multilateral financial institutions, I think we can all get behind. I'm going to allow a little bit of time for questions from the audience, but in order to allow you a little bit of time for preparation, and I'm conscious of the time as well for this conference. But let me just ask one final question to Ambassador Malcolmson, because this is an important year. There is a lot happening in the world, and in this country in particular, in terms of how things are different relationships with different countries. But we have the G20 presidency. For South Africa has the G20 presidency, and of course we also have, again, being here in the African Union mission, the African Union is a member of the G20. So what can the G20 do, if anything, on this particular agenda? Is it something that we should be discussing at the G20? Is it not? Should we just be doing stuff at home? You know, what is there a partnership aspect to this that we can achieve through South Africa's G20 presidency?
Thank you very much for that question. I was going to be a rogue panelist just now and talk about the G20 anyway, because my bosses would have killed me if I hadn't said anything about G20. So let me just state up front that as the G20 presidency this year, we've put Africa front and foremost. in our agenda for the year. And in that, as you said, we are fully supported by the African Union Commission, who now occupy a full seat at the table, a move that we had lobbied for and that we welcome warmly. We've also invited a number of other African countries to participate in all the G20 events through the year, including Nigeria, Egypt, and Algeria. And on event-specific things, we've been inviting African countries such as Angola and Ethiopia to the foreign ministers meeting. Apart from that, we've also been inviting African institutions like the ADB, AUDA-NEPAD, the AFCFTA Secretariat, as well as the regional economic communities. On the African infrastructure priorities in particular, the work on that is being done through the infrastructure working group in the finance track. And as I said, we've identified Africa, particularly in that agenda for that working group. And of course, we take Agenda 2063, PIDA, and the AFCFTA as our lodestar documents for that discussion. And they've identified 3 priorities for the year. And these are, number 1, developing an investable infrastructure pipeline. Secondly, scaling up sustainable infrastructure investment through blended finance. And 3, delivering cross-border infrastructure for regional development. On the first one, of course, it goes back to what we were saying about planning and preparation being critical in developing that robust, high-quality pipeline. And we've been assisted in this work on the first priority by the World Bank's Global Infrastructure Hub, the Global Infrastructure Facility, and the Sustainable Infrastructure Foundation. On the second priority, a key focus in the blended finance approach is to mobilize a variety of financial instruments and non-financial mechanisms to catalyze additional private financing, including by way of de-risking measures through the MDBs and the DFIs, amongst others. And this particular work has been led by the OECD and the IFC. And then the third priority, the cross-border projects, as we've heard, present very unique challenges in terms of planning, financing, implementation, and management. And we're following on work that was done in the G20 presidency of Brazil last year, where we're developing a toolkit that will hopefully help countries and regions overcome some of the barriers to unblocking these priority projects. And that work's been led by the ADB, the World Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Overall, of course, in that working group, we're emphasizing the need to create an enabling and conducive environment to facilitate significant investment and private sector participation. And we're working towards fostering a collaborative approach amongst countries, the private sector, and other stakeholders, with an emphasis on that catalytic role of the MDBs and the DFIs. 2 other areas of our presidency where we have identified key deliverables is the one about the G20 Compact with Africa. It's building on the Compact with Africa that was adopted under the German presidency in 2017. And we're aiming to broaden and elevate that compact going forward for the next 5 years, where we're going to try and support Africa's ambition of mobilizing domestic and international savings through an improved investment framework. And we'll have an event in Addis Ababa in the middle of the year to work on the compact, to discuss the compact with Africa. The very last one, which you're involved in, is the cost of capital deliverable. Where former Minister of Finance of South Africa, Trevor Manuel, is leading a panel of experts looking at impediments to development in Africa, to growth and development in Africa. And a key component of that work is the work on the cost of capital. So the panel will be delivering a report, as I say, a key component of which will be the cost of capital issues. But you're on the panel of experts, so thank you.
Yes, we're definitely working on the cost of capital issues. It's really a key aspect of that panel. So yeah, thank you. I think it's good to know also sort of what is expected from the G20 presidency. And it sounds like, again, many of the issues that we talked about are being discussed at least. And I guess the question is how to make sure that those are also Africa focused and really deliver for the African continent. Okay, I'm going to open up the floor if there's some questions here. We have 10 minutes, I think, and then we will have our closing remarks. So any hands up and anything online? If we could have a microphone. Oh, I think you could just use your mic right there. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I realize this conversation has happened without much mention of the C word, climate. So I'm just going to ask questions related to that and hope we could, bring the climate conversation into the room. So two questions. One is, how are you sort of considering environmental impacts when you're in sort of the early phase or early stages of, infrastructure investment discussions? And the second question is, how are you making sure that whatever infrastructure is being built is climate resilient?
Very good. Very concise questions. Thank you very much for that. We also have a question online. The question says, I would like to know the challenges that arose when there was a harmonization of procurement rules. When that harmonization isn't attained, what happens? How to overcome that challenge. So I think that will be to you, Honourable Moore. Anyone else for questions? Yes, let's take one more question from the floor. If you could use one of the microphones here, thank you. And please introduce yourself if possible.
My name is Desmond. My question is, when you're considering harmonization at the Africa level, is there a taxonomy of some sort that Africa can use to identify sandboxes of climate-ready investments, even as other processes are ongoing? Because if you wait 20, 15 years down the line, the finance keeps on flowing and it will be redirected to other regions. And if there's none in place, what are the measures that can be put forward to ensure that Africa does not miss out in this particular transition? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Another good question focused also on climate resilience. So, and I have to say, I think Her Excellency did bring in the climate point earlier on as well. We're talking about green infrastructure funds, so, but hopefully we'll have even more illumination of that. Let me ask our panelists to respond, and perhaps also use this opportunity to sort of, if there was, one thing for our next steps in terms of enhancing financing for cross-border, what would that be? Use this as the opportunity for closing as well. So we're going to go in the opposite order than we began. So I'm going to ask Director Fentola to kick us off, please, with responses to the audience questions.
Thank you. And environment, I don't want to make excuses for the panel, but I assume that it's almost like baseline for us when we are thinking about infrastructure and project development. I mean, there's no project that will get to financial close unless we're deeply satisfied that the environmental assessment has been done, there's an ESIA, there's all that stuff. So it's virtually baseline. It's almost like the license to operate these days for those of us in that space. And I think when we talk about climate more generally, we all do know that Africa contributes lists to global, greenhouse gas emission, but we also know that we suffer the most from the effects of climate change. So I will be shocked if there's any climate denier on this panel or even in this room, because I know that the impact of climate is felt in Africa and we see it. And so for us, thinking about climate becomes extremely important in every transaction that we do. One of the things we've done as AFC is to actually we created a subsidiary called ACP, which is AFC Capital Partners. And ACP is actually in the process of closing its first fund called Infrastructure Climate Resilience Fund. And it's really doing adaptation and essentially focused on how do we build climate resilient infrastructure. Because if you don't build right, the cost of rebuilding or the cost of repairs may actually even be more expensive than the original project cost itself. So we are ahead of that. It's something that we've been thinking about. We have the EIB, we have the Green Climate Fund as partners within that whole framework, and it's something that's very important to us. So I think, so for me, I'll just essentially say, if we're thinking about all the topic that we've discussed today about cross-border and all that, it's very important for us to think about collaboration. It's very important for us to ensure that every country is in sync. Using Lobito as an example, um, I think one of the best things the US government did for us, even though, despite all the things we've said today, but, was actually using their convening power under the previous administration, by the way, to help convene the government of Angola, Zambia, and co. And within a short time, we were able to sign a concession agreement, which essentially means that, the rail could easily be built across all these countries. So I think all the countries need to come together. We are one continent. Even to travel around Africa is a challenge. Visa is a challenge amongst ourselves. We need to stop all that. If we want to get serious about development, all those bottlenecks just have to go. If they don't go, then we are just talking and talking and nothing's going to happen.
Thank you very much. Actually, when it comes to climate, we look at PIDA, by the way, especially PIDA PAP 2. PIDA PAP 2 itself as a program is designed directly to make sure that climate resilience is even one of the criteria for the selection of the project. So we are not thinking about climate resilience or environmental impact at the end. Like by the time we start looking for funding, this is where we need to think about it. No, we did it actually in a very proactive manner upfront. So when we were selecting, by the time we were defining what we call the integrated corridor development approach, we have made sure that climate resilience, environmental impact are among the criteria that should be put forward to select any regional infrastructure projects. And we went even beyond. We did not just stop at climate. We made sure that we also have gender and youth inclusion as part of the criteria. So it's not just about the climate. That's number one. And then number two, because of the very specific challenges of regional infrastructure projects, we have, and I've said it previously, we have designed this tool that we call SDM, Service Delivery Mechanism. And in this instrument, especially, we have as well very specific features that help addressing the climate, the resilience, the environmental impact components, starting from the early project preparation stage. And finally, again with climate, when you look at actually the PIDA quality level, which is the certification tool that, by the way, we shared last year with Brazil during the G20, and that's what actually was used to design this tool that Ambassador is talking about, that's being offered by G20 for project certification. PIDA quality level have as well a huge component about climate resilience, environmental impact, and they are integral part of the climate resilience, environmental impact, environmental protections are integral part of our certification process. So this is about climate, but I want to conclude actually with the procurement, especially. If you look at, of course, one of the top challenge when you want to engage private sector, making sure that private sector access opportunities, being BOT or PPP, in terms of regulatory framework, you must be quite strong, solid. You must be as well very predictable. And we have run a study with GatePro, one of our Gate Transform, actually one of our partners from the German government, that give us some good lessons and recommendations that we start sharing with our member states. Number one, if you want really to have private sector engaging properly and engaging into infrastructure projects through proper procurement, you need to strengthen your regulatory policy, regulatory framework, but keep it as well very stable and predictable. And this is extremely important because establishing clear and stable regulatory environment actually define really private sector roles as well, and ensure that the costs are stable, they are reflective of the tariff. It brings as well, and it brings as well competition, especially competition in the bidding, and IPP, especially if it comes to the energy, would be very much interested. And second one, good procurement and bidding actually, I would say environment in the country depends as well of how much the government is capable of aligning its infrastructure's planning to its national development plan. This is extremely important because that gives actually an idea about what will come next. And then finally, and I will conclude here, again, the issue of the capacity, really, from the government side. This is extremely important because unfortunately, we really don't have all the capacity. And I will give you a number, Hannah, just to conclude. When we see the US, basically here, where people say this is a country where private sector is strong, right? Basically. But this is also the country where the public sector is massive. There is about 80 to 100 civil servants for 1,000 people in the US. Yes, if you take together the federal government, the state actually civil service, and then the county civil service as well. Whereas you go to Cameroon, it's 4 people for 1,000, 4 civil servants for 1,000 citizens. So the difference is big. So building our capacity, especially even in this, is extremely important if we want to succeed into this business of regional infrastructures. Thank you very much.
I think we just go in the line. On the question of, I don't know if the lesson is applicable universally, but at that point, I wasn't minister, I was deputy chief of staff, and I was running something called the President's Delivery Unit. We own the project. This is a project of the government of Liberia. So we weren't leaving the room until we solved the problem. So we imposed a solution on the problem. This is the point we're talking about ownership of the project. The project. So I think that if the same problem were to occur in any other country, as owner of the project, you're simply getting financing from them. You have to impose a solution on that. On the climate question, I would just say that even if there were climate deniers here, after what we saw in 2019 with Cyclone Idai across Malawi, Mozambique, and what's the third country? Zimbabwe. The amount of infrastructure that was destroyed. I can't imagine what financier will offer to finance a project today that hasn't taken into account the impact that climate would have on it. So I think we had assumed that it's a baseline in terms of going forward with infrastructure.
No, thank you very much. I think all three of the colleagues have the central concept of what they're talking about is the baseline, that it's a baseline issue to the work that we're doing on infrastructure, and it's a fundamental and integral part of the work. So taking that forward into the key events this year, I mean, obviously COP30 is the one event that's the central focus, but in each one of the other ones, the financing for development in Sevilla in June, the G20 in November, the BRICS summit, climate is also a baseline issue, and it is a fundamental and integral part of the work that we're doing within those events. To be quite frank, in the G20, we are facing some pushback on any color coding of green. anything that's called green infrastructure, green energy, there is a pushback on that. There's also a pushback on terms like dirty energy, where we're being told there's just energy. So we're going to have to maintain that line. For us, I think that will be one of the red line issues that we need to maintain, along with concepts like common but differentiated responsibility. So much as they are central, climate resilience and so on is central to the work we're doing, there are certain baseline red lines that will have to be defended in the current environment. And I think that leads me into my closing remarks, where the current developments are forcing us to be self-reliant. It's no longer a choice of being self-reliant. We're now being forced to be self-reliant. And that, I think, then is what you were referring to. I think one of the key elements in infrastructure development in Africa is ownership. As you said, the government of Liberia was the owner and therefore had to find a solution. And I think, therefore, that's the key to all of these projects is the ownership aspect, the accountability aspect, that in all of the projects, you need to have buy-in from the countries involved. You need to make the projects part of the country's development and budget priorities. You need champions within the country, and you need country champions of projects. And there needs to be, much as you're raising finance in various ways and forms internationally and so on, I think the point about domestic private sector financing is critical, but also there must be a domestic government stake in the project where you are putting money on the table to give yourself a significant stake in the project. And lastly, then, to have the proper coordination mechanisms in place to make sure that you have a central locus where this ownership and accountability can be exercised.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you for the excellent questions from the audience, and also to our brilliant set of panelists with such a wealth of experience and also opportunity to really do even more for our continent on this issue in terms of cross-border regional infrastructure. So I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to the panel just before we move to our closing remarks from a colleague from the African Union Commission, who I'll introduce very shortly. But please, let's give a very, very warm vote of thanks to our panelists for your insights. Thank you. And now without further ado, let me ask Mr. Patrick Olomo, the Acting Director for Economic Development, Integration and Trade at the African Union Commission, to deliver our closing remarks here at the African Union Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thanks to the excellent panelists. I think we have, benefited from your wisdom on this important subject. And when we listened to the conversation this morning, you could clearly see that the case of infrastructure was at the center of the priorities of our leaders, the ministers of finance and central bank governors. Why do we say so? We say so because when you look at the continental dynamics and when you look at what will shape the future of Africa's transformation, you can see that the issue of productive infrastructure remains at the center of our, priorities. That is also because it is so essential, to build productive infrastructure in the continent or within the continent to ensure that we have cross-border transactions that are important to take advantage of the potential of the African continental free trade area. And if you look at what the African Union has been able to achieve in the last few decades under the leadership of AUDA-NEPAD, which we need to really appreciate the excellent work in terms of demystifying, the issue of infrastructure development in Africa with the revamping of the PIDA, project and the excellent work that is being done there, you can see that we are certainly at a shifting point in the narrative of our development. And that is so real because when we look at the importance of infrastructure in terms of economic transformation and more importantly productive transformation, if you listen to the recent shift in the global trading system, you can see that we are absolutely right to pay attention to how we invest in infrastructure. And that investment in infrastructure, in fact, should allow the African continent to enhance its ability to achieve stronger growth at a level of 7 to 10% that is expected in the next decades to achieve Agenda 2063, our continental blueprint for economic transformation. So you can see that having, set that scene, and considering the rich discussion that you have had, we are absolutely in the process of achieving something tangible for the good of the continent. So our priority in the G20 negotiations, because it is a process, and we would like to seize the opportunity to once again appreciate the South African presidency for so eloquently setting the scene for clearly outlining what should be the priorities of a continent that has all to offer to the world, but that is not yet benefiting from the support that is expected. So in this conversation, there is one key word that we need to remind ourselves of, is the word that came, that is self-sustainability, self-reliance. We have clearly understood that at the African Union, and you may recall that we launched few years back the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions with the first purpose of addressing, the gaps that we see in terms of financing Africa's infrastructure, but more importantly, financing Africa's transformation. Because we are absolutely convinced that it is our sole responsibility to do it, because no one will do it for us. And time has come for us to take leadership in our development. And the African multilateral financial institutions with the African Development Bank and all the other institutions are our continental financial architecture that we need to strengthen and support. If you do recall the launch of the African multilateral financial institutions, you will see that our heads of states have clearly outlined the priority of supporting those institutions through optimal capitalization that will allow them to have the size that is required and to provide financing in a sustainable way to the continent. So we are in the process of implementing that, and I think the conversation that we had this afternoon is, instrumental because it is setting the path that we are all looking forward to see implemented. At the African Union, as member of the G20, we are going to echo that call for productive infrastructure because it's respond to one of the impediment to Africa's growth and economic transformation. So rest assured that with the support of Madam CEO of NEPAD and all the African Union institutions and body that are working under the coordinating role of the African Union Commission, that we will continue pushing for, strengthening support for infrastructure development. I heard about the issue of climate, resilient infrastructure. I think Africa has already shown leadership, and commitment to work towards addressing climate issues. And as was highlighted by the excellent panel that we have today, those issues are always at the center of project preparation and also of, the project decisions that we are making within the continent. So our absolute, determination to work in that direction remains the same. And even we are, upgrading our level of interventions in this direction to make sure that the African Union provides, the ground for radical transformation of its economy, considering the global dynamics that are affecting our economies. We remain committed. I think this is not the starting point of the conversation, but it is just part of the process that we started a long time ago, and that we are, going to step up our support and efforts to make sure that in this critical or at this critical moment of the history of the continent, that we are able to shape the future that we are all looking forward, the future of an integrated, a prosperous, and absolutely stronger continent in the global conversations such as infrastructure development and in all global fora. We remain committed to see support from our member states and our institutions for the Financing for Development Conference that I saw and I heard reference made to. I think it is an absolute critical moment that we need to take advantage of to make sure that finance work for Africa's infrastructure and development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick Oloma, for sharing your closing remarks with that. And on that note, having reminded us, in fact, I think that, in many ways, the current environment increases the business case for cross-border infrastructure and the steps that have already been taken in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We have a stronger than ever business case for investing in cross-border infrastructure. So let's all work towards it. So on that note, let me say thank you to all the teams involved in organizing this event. Thank you very much to the partnership of AUDA-NEPAD in bringing this together, the support of the African Union mission here in the US for, again, hosting us generously. And then also just to remind everyone that this is part of a series that we have been working with not just the African Union and African institutions, but also non-governmental organizations to bring together a series of events focused on Africa. And so we encourage you to please join the rest of those this week. We will continue these important, critical conversations as we try to build, and the urgency of building. Ambassador Malcolmson, you said self-reliance. I like to talk about self-determination. Because you can still have partnership with self-determination, but nevertheless, whatever it is, reliance, determination, we do really need to continue building that, and cross-border infrastructure is certainly one area that will significantly contribute to that development. So thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for your patience, and we look forward to seeing you a lot the rest of this week and also at the next edition of annual meetings and spring meetings. Thank you, everyone.